picture this. You're in 1978,
Right.
and there's this revolutionary leader. He's living in exile in this really quiet, leafy suburb of Paris.
Just kind of holding court, yeah.
Exactly. He's holding court with all these Western journalists, and he is pitching a vision for his own country that sounds, honestly, incredibly inclusive.
Very democratic sounding.
Yeah, he promises this thriving democratic state. I mean, he explicitly states that even Marxist groups are going to have the absolute freedom to express their views.
Which is a huge promise.
Right. And he reassures the international community, like he says he has absolutely no personal ambition to run the government.
Not at all.
And he insists that religious clerics should stay completely out of the day-to-day administration of the state. He's really presenting himself as like a moral guide, you know, not a future dictator.
Yeah, and it was a brilliantly calibrated message. I mean, he presented this platform that the international community and also these wildly diverse opposition groups back home could easily just project their own hopes onto.
Right, everyone heard what they wanted to hear.
Exactly.
But, and here is the ultimate bait and switch in, like, modern state building. Within just a few months of his triumphant return to Tehran, this exact same leader completely reverses course.
A total 180.
Yeah. He engineers one of the most rigidly theocratic, heavily surveilled, and ideologically inflexible states in modern history.
And he does it incredibly fast.
So fast. The Marxists who were promised freedom of speech, systemically purged.
Gone.
The clerics who were supposed to stay out of politics, suddenly they're running literally every single ministry. And the man who claimed no personal ambition, he installs himself at the absolute pinnacle of this authoritarian hierarchy.
Right, we are looking at the political architecture of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini.
And it really remains a masterclass in political maneuvering, you know?
It absolutely does. The central question we're exploring today in this deep dive is, well, the underlying mechanics of that pivot. We're looking at the historical blueprints of Khomeini's Iran to understand not just what he built, but the specific engineering required to sustain it.
Right.
Because constructing a state in a post-revolutionary vacuum is an entirely different skill set than, you know, just lighting the fuse that brings the old regime down.
Totally. And for you listening, whether you're a history buff or just fascinated by the raw mechanics of power, the goal here is to unpack how a leader actually pulls off a transformation of this magnitude.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, how do you consolidate control so completely while the ground is literally still shifting under your feet?
Well, the historical framework we are examining offers a really fascinating lens for that exact question.
Okay, let's hear it.
So, Khomeini's success in maintaining the Islamic Republic basically relied on synthesizing two completely opposing forces into its structural DNA.
Two opposing forces.
Right. The first is the jihadi dimension.
Meaning combative.
Exactly. Combative, uncompromising, and ruthlessly exclusionary. It's an approach completely focused on securing ideological dominance.
Okay, and the second?
The second, and I'd say far less understood, is the ijtihadi dimension.
Ijtihadi.
Yeah. And this represents an extreme pragmatism. It's a willingness to be highly flexible and logically adaptive,
Right.
specifically to ensure regime survival. So the entire architecture of modern Iran is built on the tension between those two poles.
Wow, okay. Now, before we really get into the gears of that machine, I do want to make a quick but really important note on the parameters of our deep dive today.
Good idea.
Because we are exploring some highly charged historical events here. We're talking about systemic violence, severe purges, and massive geopolitical conflict.
Right. It's heavy stuff.
Very. So our objective is to just impartially unpack the historical facts, you know, the key actors and the ideological blueprints exactly as they occurred based on the provided text.
Yeah, we are dissecting the architecture of a specific political system. We are not endorsing the viewpoints, the actions, or the ideologies of the historical figures involved.
Exactly. We're looking at this purely as analysts of statecraft, taking apart the engine to see how it ran.
Perfect way to put it.
So let's start back in that Parisian suburb in 1978, because the timeline of this ideological pivot is just incredibly compressed.
Lightning fast.
Yeah. In May of that year, Khomeini gives an interview to the French newspaper Le Monde. And his rhetoric is perfectly tailored for a Western, liberal-leaning audience.
Right. He knew exactly who he was talking to.
He really did. He claims that in his ideal society, Marxists will be completely free to express their opinions. He says he's only drawing a line at active conspiracy against the state.
And he was equally definitive about his own role, too. I
Yeah.
mean, when they pressed him on whether he would head the government, he dismissed the idea entirely.
He brought up his age, right?
Yeah, he cited his age and just his personal inclinations. He basically painted a picture of a system where qualified, competent administrators would run the country, and he would just sort of guide them with broad Islamic principles.
Right. But then fast forward just 5 months to October 1978, and he gives another interview to the exact same paper.
And things have changed.
Oh, the velvet glove is starting to come off. I mean, he's still claiming clerics won't directly rule, but he introduces this much more aggressive roadmap.
He starts talking about purges.
Exactly, the complete purging of ministries. He demands the total, non-negotiable removal of the Pahlavi dynasty. Like, he insists no incremental reform is possible while the Shah is still there.
And that escalation in his rhetoric, it was a direct response to the situation on the ground in Iran.
Because the Shah was falling fast.
Much faster than anyone anticipated. Neither Khomeini nor his inner circle really had a fully baked day-one governance strategy ready to go.
They were caught off guard.
Yeah. They expected a protracted struggle, not an imminent total collapse. So when the Shah finally fled, they were forced into this improvisation of immense proportions.
Well, you don't just improvise a government of that scale by yourself. Let's look at the people in the room with him, the inner circle that actually executed this takeover.
It's a fascinating group.
It really is, and they essentially broke down into two distinct camps. You had the clerics and the non-clerics. Let's start with the clerics, because these guys are the architects of the permanent state.
Yeah, and right at the center of that group, you have Ayatollah Mohammad Beheshti.
Okay, Beheshti.
He is vital to understanding the mechanics of this revolution. He was a highly shrewd organizational genius.
So if Khomeini is the visionary...
Well, Beheshti is the tactician. He's the one actually building the institutional framework behind the scenes. He was so ruthless in his political maneuvering that his critics internally refer to him as Ayatollah Rasputin.
Oh, wow. Ayatollah Rasputin, that tells you a lot.
Yeah, he was the unquestioned heir apparent in the early days.
And alongside him, you have Hashemi Rafsanjani and Ali Khamenei.
Right, and they had this deep historical camaraderie stretching all the way back to the 1950s.
They were tight.
Very. And Rafsanjani, in particular, he was the ultimate connector. I mean, he had spent years maintaining these underground networks between anti-Shah groups inside Iran and Khomeini over in exile. So he had earned an unshakable level of trust.
Makes sense. And rounding out this clerical core was Mohammad Reza Mahdavi Khani, right?
Yeah, Mahdavi Khani. He was a hardline enforcer. He was handed major security responsibilities pretty much immediately after the takeover.
But the thing is, early on, they couldn't run the country on theology alone.
No, not at all.
They needed technocrats. They needed people who actually understood economics, international relations, basic administration.
Which brings in the non-clerical side of the inner circle.
And this group is fascinating because of how thoroughly diverse it is. I mean, you have Abul Hassan Bani Sadr, who's this French-educated economist.
And his relationship with Khomeini was incredibly close. Khomeini treated him essentially as an adopted son.
Really?
Yeah, gave him immense preferential treatment early on.
Wow. And then you also have Mehdi Bazargan, who is a liberal-minded French-educated engineer.
Yeah.
And he possessed this massive popular base inside Iran.
Right. And Bazargan was actually chosen to be the first prime minister of the interim government.
Oh, to project a moderate face?
Specifically for that reason, to project a face of moderate, competent governance to the rest of the world.
Smart. Then there's Sadegh Ghounsada, a former student activist in the U.S. who became this really sophisticated media advisor in Paris.
Yep.
And Ibrahim Yazdi, an Iranian-American physician acting as the primary back-channel communicator between Khomeini's camp and Washington, D.C. in those crucial final weeks.
Right. So if you look at this dynamic, you've got the visionary founder making these sweeping promises.
Yeah.
You've got the ruthless tacticians organizing the back end.
Yeah.
And then the Western-educated technocrats brought in to legitimize the whole operation.
It operates almost exactly like a massive Silicon Valley startup.
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Think about it. The founder is in the garage, or, in this case, Paris.
Right.
And he's pitching this idealistic, world-changing vision to secure buy-in from wildly different investors.
And the investors are the revolutionary factions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The Marxists, the secular liberals, the bazaar merchants, the student unions. He promises them all exactly what they need to hear, so they'll help him overthrow the incumbent monopoly, which is the Shah.
I like that analogy. Because to push it further, the moment the incumbent monopoly collapses, Khomeini secures all the capital.
He owns the company now.
He suddenly owns the country.
Oh.
And the minute he has the keys to the building, he realizes he no longer needs those early investors.
Right.
So the jihadi element of his strategy was essentially a hostile takeover of the boardroom. He pushed out those liberal and Marxist investors.
Just boxed them out.
Yeah, but the ijtihadi element, the pragmatism, was his realization that he still needed the engineers.
The non-clerics. Like Beni Sadr and Bazargan.
Right. He needed them temporarily just to keep the servers running while he trained his loyalists to eventually take over those technical roles.
That makes so much sense. But that transition, from an inclusive coalition to a hostile takeover, it requires immense immediate force. I mean, you can't just send an email firing the old regime.
No, you have to physically dismantle it.
Exactly. Which brings us to the operational reality of that jihadi dimension. In the mechanics of Khomeini's state building, what does a jihadi approach actually look like on the ground?
Operationally, it manifests as a completely uncompromising binary worldview.
Binary, how so?
There is zero gray area. Policies, institutions, individuals, they're either entirely aligned with Khomeini's specific interpretation of Islam, or they are deemed un-Islamic and they are targeted for removal.
Wow.
It is a self-righteous drive to purify the state apparatus.
And purification in a political context that almost always means purges. The violence following the Shah's fall was swift and systematic. They didn't just fire the old administrators, they eliminated them. We see this acutely with figures like Amir Abbas Hoveyda.
Right, the Shah's longest-serving prime minister.
Yeah, he was swiftly executed.
And the mechanism for this purification was the newly established Islamic Revolutionary Court. Khomeini appointed Ayatollah Sadegh Khomeini to run it.
Khomeini.
Yes. And Khomeini operated with just terrifying efficiency. He utilized these summary trials that often lasted literally minutes.
Minutes for a capital offense.
Minutes, lacking any standard legal defense. He earned the moniker the hanging judge because he rapidly executed hundreds of former military officers, members of the Savak secret police, and civil servants.
The sheer scale of it is staggering when you look at the data. I mean, Amnesty International compiled figures showing that roughly 3,800 actual or suspected opponents were executed just in the initial wave.
And that was just the beginning.
Yeah, because over the first 3 years, as the state really solidified its grip, estimates of eliminated opponents ballooned to anywhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people.
And it's important to understand, the goal wasn't just punishment. It was institutional clearing.
A clearinghouse.
Exactly. By executing or imprisoning the upper and middle management of the old state, they created an artificial vacuum. And then they rapidly backfilled those administrative, military, and security positions with loyal, albeit inexperienced, clerical supporters.
So they literally dismantle the old machine just to use its parts for a new one.
Exactly.
But you still need to legitimize that new machine, right?
Yeah.
You need public buy-in, or at least the illusion of it.
Right, you need some kind of mandate.
And they achieved this through a national referendum in March 1979. The framing of this referendum is honestly a brilliant piece of political psychology.
It really is. They completely bypassed any complex constitutional debates.
They just kept it simple.
Incredibly simple. They presented the population with a single binary choice. Do you want an Islamic Republic, yes or no?
That's it. Just yes or no.
That's it.
And it passed with an astonishing 99.7% approval.
But when you look closely at that number, the public was really voting on an emotional abstraction.
Right. They were voting against something, not necessarily for something.
Precisely. They were voting no to a return of the Shah far more than they were voting yes to a specific theological framework. Because honestly, that framework hadn't even been fully articulated yet.
But that 99.7%, that was the only mandate Khomeini needed.
It was a blank check.
Yeah. With that numerical validation, he convened an assembly that was heavily dominated by his loyalists to draft a new constitution. And this document cemented Sharia law as the state's foundation, and it formalized the doctrine of Velayat-e-Faqih.
Velayat-e-Faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist.
This is the absolute linchpin of the entire system. Can we break down how this actually restructures power? Because historically, my understanding is that Shia clerics generally advocated for a quietist approach.
Right. They typically stayed out of direct government rule until the return of the Mahdi, the hidden imam.
But Khomeini flips that entirely on its head.
He executes a massive theological reinterpretation. Khomeini argued that in the absence of the hidden imam, the most learned religious jurist doesn't just have the right to advise the government.
Okay.
He argued that jurist has the divine mandate to be the ultimate authority of the government.
Wow.
So he institutionalized himself as the supreme leader, creating this wildly complex dual-tiered constitutional structure.
Let's map out that structure, because for anyone trying to understand modern Iran, this is the master blueprint. It's built on two competing levels of sovereignty, right? Popular sovereignty and divine sovereignty.
Right. So the popular sovereignty tier is designed to mimic a modern representative republic.
Okay.
You have a president elected directly by the people. You have a unicameral parliament, known as the Majlis, whose members are also elected.
So on paper, this looks like a system where the populace dictates domestic policy.
On paper, yes.
But hovering directly over that is the divine sovereignty tier. And this is where the real mechanics of control sit.
Absolutely.
At the absolute apex is the supreme leader, who holds overarching, totally unchecked power. He controls the armed forces, he appoints the head of the judiciary, and he essentially dictates the broad strokes of all state policy.
And bridging the gap between the supreme leader and those elected bodies is perhaps the most crucial enforcement mechanism in the entire Constitution.
Which is?
The Council of Guardians.
Ah, the council.
Yeah. This is an unelected 12-member body. 6 are clerics appointed directly by the supreme leader.
Okay.
And 6 are jurists nominated by the head of the judiciary, who, remember, is also appointed by the supreme leader.
Okay, I look at this interlocking mechanism, and it immediately reminds me of a heavily rigged corporate governance structure.
How do you mean?
Well, imagine you work at a massive corporation, right? And you and all the other employees are told, hey, you have a voice.
Right.
You get to vote for the CEO, that's the president. You vote for the department managers, that's the parliament. But there is a shadow board of directors, the Council of Guardians.
Okay, I see where you're going.
And this shadow board has the absolute right to pre-vet anyone running for CEO. If they don't like a candidate's ideology, they disqualify them before the employees can even vote.
Right, they control the ballot.
Exactly. Furthermore, if the CEO or the manager somehow pass a rule the shadow board dislikes, the board can unilaterally veto it. And sitting above all of them is the founder, the supreme leader, who can fire the head of corporate security and rewrite the company charter on a whim.
Your corporate board analogy perfectly highlights the systemic choke point. The Council of Guardians acts as the ultimate ideological filter. It guarantees that the popular sovereignty tier can literally never produce legislation or leaders that threaten the divine sovereignty tier.
But if you're listening to this and wondering how a modern, politically active populace accepts a shadow government that just blatantly neuters their vote, you really have to look beyond just the Constitution.
Because a piece of paper alone doesn't hold power.
Exactly. A structure that contradictory needs brute force to keep it standing.
Precisely. The constitutional architecture would have collapsed under its own hypocrisy if Khomeini hadn't simultaneously built massive parallel institutions to act as the physical enforcers of the jihadi dimension.
Right.
He established 3 primary pillars of control that permeated literally every level of society.
Let's break down those enforcers. First, you have the political vanguard, the Islamic Republican Party, or IRP.
Which was the brainchild of Ayatollah Beheshti.
Ayatollah Rasputin.
The very same. The IRP functioned as an umbrella organization. It swept up all these disparate Islamic political factions and forged them into a single, highly disciplined, conservative juggernaut just to dominate the newly created parliament.
So they were the legislative muscle.
Exactly.
But the street-level muscle came from the Basij. Ah, the Basij.
The Basij was created as an organization for mobilization of the oppressed. It was a voluntary paramilitary force, but its recruitment strategy was, honestly, chillingly pervasive.
Yeah, they recruited children as young as 10 years old.
10 years old? I mean, think about the mechanics of that. You are indoctrinating youth at an incredibly formative age with absolute theological loyalty to the supreme leader.
And you deploy them locally. The Basij operated out of local mosques in nearly every single neighborhood, so they became the decentralized eyes and ears of the regime.
Just watching everyone.
Right. They enforced modesty laws, they monitored their neighbors, and they provided this massive pool of bodies to maintain internal security. It was a localized surveillance state driven by pure ideological fervor.
And then sitting above the neighborhood level, you have the elite military enforcers, the SIPA, globally known as the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC.
Right. And it's important to distinguish them from the regular army. The traditional Iranian army was reorganized and strictly tasked with defending the nation's physical borders.
But the IRGC was given a distinct constitutional mandate to defend the ideology of the revolution itself,
So they operated as a parallel military structure.
answering only to the supreme leader, designed explicitly to crush internal dissent and prevent any kind of military coup.
So you have the political party, the neighborhood surveillance, and the elite military. But none of those function without infinite capital.
Oh, absolutely not. They need money.
Lots of it. And this brings us to what I think is the most brilliant, ruthless economic maneuver of the revolution, the bonyads.
The Islamic foundations.
Yeah, and how they function is crucial to understanding Iran's survival.
Well, Islamic charitable endowments, or waqfs,
Hmm.
had existed for centuries. That wasn't new. But the revolutionary government weaponized them.
How so?
When the Shah fled, he and his elite associates left behind unimaginable wealth. We're talking palaces, factories, banks, vast agricultural holdings.
Just abandoned.
Right, so the new state simply expropriated all of it, but they didn't absorb it into the formal government budget. Instead, they poured all these assets into the bonyads.
Take the foundation of the oppressed and disabled as an example. It absorbed so much expropriated capital that it transformed into an unstoppable megacorporation.
Oh, massive.
We are talking about controlling hundreds of factories, luxury hotels, major real estate developments, shipping lines, and massive stakes in the petrochemical industry.
And here is the structural genius of the maneuver. These bonyads operated entirely outside the standard national budget.
Right.
They were heavily legally exempt from taxation and almost entirely shielded from any parliamentary oversight. The clerics, appointed by the supreme leader, just ran them as massive, untaxed shadow economies.
It is estimated that these foundations eventually controlled upwards of 30% of the entire national GDP.
A third of the economy.
Imagine a third of a country's economic output existing in a tax-free black box, completely controlled by an unelected religious elite.
It's wild. And they use this endless cash flow to fund patronage networks, pay the salaries of the paramilitaries, and even project soft power by funding aligned militant groups across the Middle East.
So with the economy, the military, and the political system completely captured by these new jihadi institutions, the interim technocrats, the engineers from our startup analogy, they become entirely obsolete.
They are no longer needed.
And that triggers the purge of the inner circle. The revolution begins devouring the very people who legitimized it in Paris.
It happens so fast.
Let's look at the speed of their downfalls. Mehdi Bazargan, the moderate prime minister chosen to reassure the world. He resigns in utter frustration less than a year in. He realizes his government has literally no actual power over the clerics or the revolutionary committees.
He just walked away.
Yeah. Then Abu Hassan Bani Saad, the French-educated economist Khomeini, treated like a son. He actually wins the first presidential election in 1980 with a massive mandate.
But he resisted the total clerical takeover of the state.
Right. And because of that, the Council of Guardians and the IRP turn on him. Within 16 months, he is impeached, forced into hiding, and eventually flees back to Paris.
And he actually escaped alongside Masoud Rajavi, who was the leader of the militant Mujahideen-e-Khalq group.
Oh, wow, that's right. And then there's Sadegh Ghotzadeh, the media-savvy foreign minister who stood next to Khomeini in France.
Yeah.
He is arrested, subjected to a televised confession, and executed in 1982 for allegedly plotting a coup against Khomeini.
Executed. And, the purges weren't just limited to the secular technocrats.
Right. They went after their own.
Absolutely. High-ranking clerics who possessed independent power bases and opposed the absolute concept of vilayat-e-faqih were systematically neutralized.
Like Grand Ayatollah Shariat Madari.
Prime example. He was vastly respected, arguably senior to Khomeini in theological circles. He had actually intervened to save Khomeini's life from the Shah's executioners back in 1963.
He literally saved his life.
Yes, but because he advocated for a less draconian application of Islam, he was accused of treason, defrocked in this humiliating public campaign, and spent his final years under strict house arrest.
But I think the most profound tragedy of this era is Ayatollah Hossein Ali Montazeri.
Yeah, that's the dark chapter.
Because this wasn't just a political rival. Montazeri was Khomeini's chosen official successor. He was the architect of much of the revolutionary ideology. But he possessed a fatal flaw for a jihadi system.
He had a conscience.
Exactly, an unyielding conscience regarding human rights.
Montazeri watched the escalating brutality of the regime, and he just could not remain silent.
Okay.
And the breaking point really arrived in 1988.
Right, following an incursion by the militant Mujahideen-e-Khalq.
Yeah. The regime initiated these massive secret tribunals in the prisons. Over a period of months, they systematically executed thousands of political prisoners who were already serving sentences and just dumped them in unmarked mass graves.
Thousands of people.
Thousands.
And we know exactly how Montazeri reacted because decades later, in 2016, his family leaked the audio recordings of a meeting he held with the tribunal judges.
Have you heard those tapes?
I have. In these tapes, you can hear the heir apparent absolutely excoriating the regime's leadership. He essentially tells them that history will condemn them as criminals.
Right.
He reminds them that the whole point of fighting the Shah was to end political executions. And he points out that the Islamic Republic had just slaughtered exponentially more people in a few weeks than the Shah did in years.
He knew full well that vocalizing that truth would cost him the supreme leadership.
But he did it anyway.
He did. And it did cost him. Khomeini swiftly revoked his succession status, literally tore down his portraits across the country, and placed him under long-term house arrest.
It's like a Greek tragedy. The machine demanded absolute compliance, and Montazeri refused to supply it.
He chose his conscience over the throne.
Yeah. You know, observing this relentless, grinding purge of allies, saviors, and successors, it becomes clear that a system built on a jihadi framework, which defines itself by opposition and purification, it intrinsically requires enemies to survive.
Absolutely. If you don't have an enemy, the paramilitary forces lose their purpose. The tribunals lose their mandate, and the public starts questioning the domestic missions.
Why are we suffering if there's no bad guy?
Exactly. The logic of a combative revolutionary ideology demands perpetual motion. Once the domestic landscape was thoroughly sanitized of Marxists, liberals, and dissenting clerics, the regime naturally and necessarily projected that antagonism outward
They needed a global adversary.
to justify the domestic state of emergency.
And if you're shopping for an external enemy in 1979 to unify a revolutionary Islamic populace, you go straight for the architects of the global order.
Right to the top.
They codified this in a ubiquitous national chant, neither East nor West, but Islamic. It was a total rejection of the Cold War binary.
They framed the Islamic Republic as the sole sovereign vanguard of the Muslim world, defying both superpowers. I mean, Khomeini launched blistering rhetorical attacks on pro-Western Arab monarchies, framing them as corrupt puppets. And of course, targeted Israel as an illegitimate colonial implant.
But the absolute focal point of this externalized jihadi aggression was the United States, famously branded by Khomeini as the Great Satan.
Right.
And this wasn't just rhetoric. It crystallized into physical conflict in November 1979 with the U.S. Embassy hostage crisis.
To really understand the mechanics of that crisis, you have to look at the immediate trigger.
Which was the Shah.
Exactly. The ousted Shah was dying of cancer in Mexico. And despite warnings from diplomats on the ground in Tehran, the Carter administration yielded to political pressure and admitted the Shah into the U.S. for medical treatment.
Now, to the revolutionaries in Iran, this wasn't some humanitarian gesture. It was a terrifying echo of history.
Because of 1953.
Right. Decades earlier, the CIA had orchestrated a coup to reinstall the Shah. So admitting him to New York looked exactly like the prelude to another American-backed counter-revolution.
So in direct response, militant student followers of Khomeini stormed the heavily fortified U.S. Embassy compound in Tehran, which they labeled a den of spies.
And they seized 52 American diplomats and citizens. What followed was a grueling 444-day standoff. It was a geopolitical crisis, obviously, but at its core, it was a deeply personal clash of ideological worldviews.
Oh, absolutely. On one side, you have U.S. President Jimmy Carter. He's a devout, born-again Christian engineer who viewed diplomacy through this lens of rational statecraft and moralism.
Right.
On the other side, you have Khomeini, a fundamentalist cleric, operating on absolute theological certainty, who saw the conflict as literally a cosmic battle against corruption. Carter viewed Khomeini as irrational and fanatical. Khomeini viewed Carter as the avatar of arrogant imperialism.
And the standoff delivered immense domestic utility for Khomeini. I mean, remember, the hostage crisis unfolded precisely as the new, highly controversial Islamic constitution was being finalized.
The timing was perfect for him.
By creating an existential confrontation with a superpower, Khomeini triggered a massive wave of hyper-nationalism. So anyone who criticized the new clerical constitution was instantly branded a traitor, siding with the Americans.
It completely paralyzed domestic opposition.
And that domestic utility was cemented by an absolute disaster for the U.S. in April 1980, which was Operation Eagle Claw.
Right. The Carter administration attempted this highly complex, covert military rescue mission deep inside Iran.
But it failed catastrophically before they ever even reached Tehran.
Yeah, a severe haboob, a desert sandstorm, crippled the mechanics of the operation. Helicopters suffered hydraulic failures. In the ensuing confusion at the staging area known as Desert 1, a helicopter actually collided with a transport plane.
The whole mission was aborted, leaving 8 American servicemen dead in the burning wreckage on the Iranian salt flats.
And if you put yourself in Khomeini's shoes, he didn't have to fire a single shot to defeat the most technologically advanced military on Earth.
It's wild.
He brilliantly weaponized the mechanical failure, framing the sandstorm as the literal hand of God intervening to protect the Islamic Republic. He spun a logistical nightmare into unassailable theological proof that his state was divinely sanctioned.
And that victory solidified a culture of anti-American defiance that really became a cornerstone of regime identity.
Definitely.
But true to the neither east doctrine, Khomeini was equally antagonistic toward the other superpower. He viewed the Soviet Union with deep suspicion, seeing their ideology as godless, materialist, and inherently expansionist.
And that suspicion was completely validated when the Soviets invaded neighboring Afghanistan in late 1979.
Right, so Khomeini immediately threw his support behind Afghan resistance groups, specifically arming and funding the Shia factions fighting the Red Army. He essentially opened a proxy front against Moscow.
He coupled that proxy war with an astonishing level of diplomatic audacity. Jump to January 1989. As the Soviet bloc was visibly fracturing, Khomeini dispatched a personal letter to Mikhail Gorbachev.
The text of this letter is just mind-boggling.
It really is.
He is writing to the leader of a massive nuclear superpower, and he bluntly tells him it is clear to everyone that communism should henceforth be sought in world museums of political history.
He doesn't ask for a treaty.
No. He diagnoses the spiritual bankruptcy of Marxism and literally invites Gorbachev to study Islam to fill the ideological void of the failing Soviet state.
It perfectly captures the essence of his jihadi foreign policy. Its absolute self-righteousness and utter refusal to bow to traditional diplomatic deference, and a masterful use of provocation to project power far beyond Iran's actual military capabilities.
And we see that precise combination of provocation and power projection again in 1989 with the infamous Salman Rushdie fatwa.
Oh, right.
Khomeini issues a religious edict commanding the execution of the British author, claiming his novel, The Satanic Verses, was blasphemous against Islam.
This action instantly severed diplomatic ties with Britain and caused violent protests globally. However, an essential strategic nuance is how it was received in the broader Middle East.
Okay, how so?
Well, many Sunni-dominated Arab states deliberately downplayed or just completely ignored the fatwa.
Why is that?
Because they saw right through the religious framing. They recognized it as a calculated political maneuver by Khomeini to claim supreme leadership over the entire global Muslim ummah, overriding the Sunni-Shia divide. The Arab monarchs basically refused to validate his authority.
That makes a lot of sense. But all of these provocations, the hostages, the proxy wars, the fatwas, they were ultimately secondary to the crucible that permanently forged the Islamic Republic, which is the Iran-Iraq War.
Yes, it stands as the longest, bloodiest, and most economically devastating conventional war in the modern history of the Middle East, lasting from 1980 to 1988.
Saddam Hussein, the secular dictator of Iraq, looked across the border and saw a country in post-revolutionary chaos.
Right, its military purge of top officers, internally fractured. So he invaded, aiming for a quick victory to seize oil-rich territory and establish himself as the undisputed hegemon of the Persian Gulf.
And he had the financial and military backing of nearly the entire region. The Sunni Arab monarchies, who were terrified by Khomeini's calls to export the Shia revolution, they poured billions into Saddam's war chest.
Even the United States and European powers eventually provided intelligence and dual-use technology to Iraq, viewing Saddam as a necessary containment measure against Iranian expansionism.
So Iran is totally isolated.
Completely. And yet, despite facing chemical weapons and global isolation, Iranian forces managed to halt the Iraqi advance and push them back. They combined the remnants of the regular army with massive waves of ideologically driven Basij and IRGC volunteers.
But the ensuing trench warfare resulted in catastrophic attrition. The economic metrics of this war are just apocalyptic. I mean, Iranian oil revenues plummeted from over $21 billion in 1983 to a mere $6.3 billion by 1986.
Urban poverty exploded. Supply chains collapsed.
At its height, the war apparatus was consuming an estimated 60 to 70% of the entire national budget.
It was devastating. And this brings us back to the core mechanics of state building under extreme pressure. Because from a conventional strategic viewpoint, fighting a grueling 8-year war while simultaneously antagonizing both global superpowers is suicidal.
Yeah, it's like a captain deliberately steering a leaking ship into a Category 5 hurricane while setting the lifeboats on fire. Why wouldn't a leader seek a diplomatic off-ramp to save his economy?
Because the hurricane provided the perfect cover to rebuild the ship exactly as he wanted it.
Wow.
The war served as an all-consuming, unifying distraction. Khomeini brilliantly fused deeply rooted Iranian nationalism, the defense of the historical homeland against an Arab invader, with the martyrdom narratives of Shia Islam.
So the public was distracted.
The public was so focused on the existential trauma of the war that the regime could implement draconian theocratic controls, silence dissenters, and execute political prisoners without facing massive mass uprisings. The economic cost was horrific, but politically, the war was the anvil upon which the Islamic Republic was hammered into a permanent shape.
But here's the reality of physics and politics. You cannot run an engine at 1,000 RPMs forever.
No, you can't.
Eventually, the adrenaline wears off, the treasury empties, and the populace exhausts itself. A state built purely on combative, jihadi conflict will eventually implode.
And that realization triggers the essential pivot in our narrative. To prevent the collapse of the state, Khomeini activates the ijtihadi dimension.
Right.
This is the mechanism that allows a rigid theocracy to survive in a dynamic world.
Let's define the mechanics of ijtihadi in this context because it explains so much of Iran's seemingly contradictory behavior over the last 4 years.
Okay, so ijtihad is a traditional Islamic legal concept. It refers to the use of independent human reasoning by qualified jurists to reinterpret Islamic principles to address new, unprecedented circumstances.
No, it's built-in flexibility.
Exactly. It is the built-in mechanism for flexibility. And coupled with this is the concept of taqiyya.
Taqiyya.
Yes. The permissible practice of concealing one's true beliefs or making tactical compromises when facing overwhelming danger, specifically to protect the faith or the community.
Okay, so translated into statecraft, ijtihadi pragmatism means that the supreme priority is the survival of the state.
Right.
If ideological purity threatens the existence of the regime, purity takes a backseat to pragmatism.
Exactly. Khomeini wasn't just a blind zealot. He was a highly calculated operator who knew precisely when to bend his own rules.
And we see this pragmatism masterfully applied to how he managed his own internal power base. Because in a purely totalitarian state, you enforce absolute conformity within the ruling party.
Right.
But Khomeini realized that if you seal a high-pressure environment without a release valve, it explodes. So once he had eliminated all external opposition, he actually permitted and quietly encouraged factionalism to develop among his loyalist clerics.
Yeah, the internal landscape of the regime essentially split into 3 distinct competing clusters.
Let's break those down.
First, you have the jihadis. These are the hardline traditionalists. Figures like Ali Khamenei emerged here. Their platform was total cultural purity, fierce anti-Western militancy, and a command economy striving for total self-sufficiency.
Oh, so they're the hardliners.
Right. Opposing them within the system were the ijtihadis, the reformists. They organized under the banner of the Assembly of Assertive Clerics, led by figures like Mehdi Karoubi and Mohammad Khatami.
And what do they want?
Their vision was startlingly progressive for a theocracy. They argued for the expansion of civil society, democratic accountability within the Islamic framework, relaxed social controls, and cautious diplomatic engagement with the outside world.
Wow, quite a contrast. And then there's a third group.
Yes, sitting in the middle, acting as the power brokers, were the Amalgarin, the centrists or pragmatists. This faction revolved around Hashemi Rafsanjani.
The ultimate connector.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They weren't particularly interested in the reformist democratic ideals, nor were they obsessed with the hardliners' cultural purity. Their singular focus was technocratic efficiency, modernizing the economy from the top down, integrating into global markets, and adopting whatever technical relations with the West were necessary to enrich the state.
So allowing these factions to fiercely debate policy in the parliament and the press achieved two things. It gave the public an illusion of democratic choice, channeling their frustrations into sanctioned political rivalries rather than against the supreme leader.
Right.
And it allowed Khomeini to sit above the fray, acting as the ultimate, indispensable referee.
And he proved how committed he was to this fluid dynamic in 1987. The Islamic Republican Party, the massive political vanguard he used to crush his early rivals, had become hopelessly deadlocked by these internal ideological wars.
So what did he do?
Instead of siding with one faction and purging the others, Khomeini simply abolished the IRP entirely. He just dissolved his own party, deciding that a flexible, nonpartisan cluster system was far more resilient than a rigid, monolithic structure that might crack under pressure.
That is supreme political agility. But I think the most striking example of ijtihadi pragmatism overriding jihadi ideology occurred in the social and economic management of the country, specifically regarding women.
Yeah, this is a paradox that often baffles outside observers.
Because on one hand, the state utilized brutal jihadi enforcement regarding social aesthetics. Women were strictly forced into the mandatory hijab enforced by the moral policing of the Basi. This was the highly visible, non-negotiable symbol of the regime's ideological dominance over public space.
Yet simultaneously, the state aggressively pursued policies that seem entirely contradictory to traditional patriarchal theocracies.
Right. The regime poured massive resources into female education, heavily promoted women entering the workforce, and implemented one of the most successful progressive family planning and birth control programs in the developing world.
So how do you reconcile those two realities? How do you mandate the veil while simultaneously encouraging women to become engineers and doctors?
You look at the grim demographic realities of the Iran-Iraq War.
Right.
The state had mobilized a massive portion of its male population to the front lines, resulting in the loss of an estimated 300,000 to 500,000 men, with countless others permanently disabled.
So the Iranian economy was facing a catastrophic labor shortage.
Exactly. The state simply could not function without integrating women into the machinery. They needed women to run the universities, staff the hospitals, manage the factories, and maintain the administrative bureaucracy.
So Khomeini applied ijtihadi pragmatism. The jihadi mandate of the hijab was enforced to satisfy the conservative clerics and project an image of absolute moral control.
Huh.
But practically, Khomeini utilized state power to ensure women were highly educated and integrated into the economy.
The ideological aesthetic was uncompromising, but the economic mechanics were fundamentally pragmatic. Survival dictated policy.
And that exact same formula, ideological hostility masking desperate pragmatism, defined his approach to foreign policy in the later years of his rule. Because the neither East nor West doctrine had resulted in total economic isolation.
Right, they were locked out of Western markets and under severe U.S. sanctions. The economy was suffocating.
So if the West is closed off, the pragmatists must look east. And they did so with remarkable speed, entirely ignoring the ideological rhetoric they had utilized just years prior.
Right. Remember the letter where Khomeini essentially called the Soviet Union a godless, spiritually dead society?
Oh, yeah.
That didn't stop the shipping containers. In the first 3 years following the revolution, trade volume between Iran and the USSR skyrocketed, jumping from roughly 1 million tons to over 3.5 million tons.
They formalized this with a major protocol on economic cooperation in 1981, and they utilized Soviet-aligned states like Syria to funnel crucial weaponry into the country.
And China became an even more critical lifeline.
Yes. During the Iran-Iraq War, China operated as a massive agnostic arms supplier, accounting for over 11% of all weapons flowing into Iran.
They provided those Silkworm missiles, right?
Yeah, the HY-2 Silkworm anti-ship missiles, which allowed Iran to threaten oil shipping in the Persian Gulf. By the end of the 1980s, Beijing had initiated civilian nuclear cooperation with Tehran, and bilateral trade had tripled to $1.7 billion.
They also heavily targeted India. New Delhi represented a massive non-aligned economy. Iran set up the India-Iran Joint Commission in 1983, specifically engineering trade routes and economic partnerships designed to bypass American financial sanctions.
The global takeaway here is profound. A regime that defines itself by divine mandate will happily purchase advanced weaponry from a communist state and trade heavy industry with secular nations if it means keeping the domestic lights on and the borders secure.
It fundamentally reshapes how we understand Khomeini. He wasn't just a fiery preacher capable of moving masses. He was an utterly unsentimental architect who recognized that ideology is a tool, not a suicide pact.
Well said.
When the jihadi rhetoric mobilized the public, he used it. When the ijtihadi pragmatism was required to pay the bills, he pivoted without hesitation.
And that dual capacity to be immensely rigid on the surface while remaining startlingly elastic underneath is the precise reason the Islamic Republic survived the 1980s.
Which brings us to the final chapter of his rule and the complex legacy he left behind. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini died of natural causes in June of 1989. And the immediate aftermath really demonstrated the sheer, inescapable gravity of his presence.
The outpouring of public emotion was astronomical. The logistical scale of his funeral in Tehran was unprecedented in the region.
It was massive.
Crowds were estimated to be the largest since the funeral of Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser decades earlier. Millions of Iranians, many genuinely heartbroken, flooded the streets, culminating in scenes of absolute frantic grief.
He was interred in a massive complex situated on the plains between Tehran and the holy city of Qom. And there's a physical detail about this site that serves as the ultimate metaphor for the state he built.
Oh, the scaffolding.
Yes, the mausoleum, this massive structure with golden domes and soaring minarets, is permanently wrapped in a sprawling web of metal scaffolding.
Decades after his death, the complex remains perpetually under construction.
It is the perfect embodiment of the Islamic Republic itself, a perpetual, unfinished revolution, a massive ideological project that requires constant maintenance, constant retrofitting, and endless enforcement to prevent it from collapsing under its own weight.
They never quite arrived at the pristine, divine utopia that was promised to those early investors back in Paris.
No, and that failure to deliver utopia has resulted in a profoundly fractured legacy today.
Very fractured.
For the loyalists who operate the institutions, he built the IRGC, the bonyads, the conservative clergy. Khomeini remains an unassailable champion. They view him as the leader who restored Islamic dignity, successfully defied Western imperialism, and forged a sovereign state capable of defending itself.
But step outside those institutional fortresses, and the assessment is starkly different.
Completely different.
For vast segments of the Iranian population, the legacy is defined by the human cost of the machine he built. They point to the systemic human rights abuses, the crushing of civil liberties, the devastating economic isolation, and the entrenched, institutionalized corruption of that shadow economy.
There is a highly resonant perspective captured in a contemporary observation of the mausoleum today that's mentioned in the text. A visiting cleric notes the significantly dwindling crowds, interpreting it as a tragic loss of revolutionary fervor among the youth.
Right. But a local Iranian man standing nearby offers a much more brutal, pragmatic assessment. He says, and this cuts right to the bone, no one remembers the revolution or Imam Khomeini anymore. He was a good man on a righteous path, but the revolution died with him. There is no help for disenfranchised people anymore.
Wow. That quote really captures the ultimate paradox. A revolution launched in the name of the oppressed ultimately replaced a royal oligarchy with a sprawling, heavily militarized bureaucratic theocracy that many citizens feel is just as alienating as the system it destroyed.
Which brings us back to our central thesis. Khomeini set out in 1978 to manifest a flawless, divinely inspired state. He utilized every conceivable tool of statecraft: manipulation, staggering violence, mass mobilization, grueling warfare, and cynical pragmatism.
Did the revolution fail because it never reached utopia? Or did it succeed because it managed to institutionalize itself against all mathematical odds?
Well, building on everything we've unpacked, the structural conclusion is that it achieved its primary directive: survival. The Islamic Republic endures precisely because Khomeini hardwired it with that dual DNA.
Right.
The jihadi institutions, the IRGC, the Council of Guardians, they provide a titanium shell that resists external pressure and internal reform. But the ijtihadi pragmatism, the ability to pivot geopolitically, manage factions, and adapt economically, gives the state just enough elasticity to keep from snapping in half.
It is a machine designed for longevity, not for the happiness of its components. Which leaves me with a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. We live in an era currently obsessed with disruption. We celebrate political outsiders who promise to tear down corrupt establishments and burn the old systems to the ground.
We love the fiery rhetoric of the explosion.
We really do. But the brutal, pragmatic blueprint of Khomeini's state building suggests a terrifying reality. Anyone with enough charisma and anger can light a fuse and create a crater. The true, terrifying test of power isn't the explosion. It's whether the leader has the ruthless architectural skills to build a new machine inside that crater capable of surviving the vacuum they just created.
That's the real test.
It begs the question, are today's loudest disruptive leaders actually capable of building structures that will outlast their own rhetoric? Or are we just living in an era of endless fractured explosions, cheering on the demolition with no architects left to rebuild? Keep questioning the architecture of the systems around you. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Picture this. It's the summer of 1981. You're the democratically elected president of a nation of, like, nearly 40 million people.
Right.
You won your election by a massive landslide, over 75% of the vote. So you have a clear mandate from the people.
Yeah, a massive mandate.
But right now, you are standing in a safe house, and you're shaving off your trademark mustache. You put on a disguise, you sneak out to an airstrip, and you literally hijack an Air Force Boeing 707 just to flee your own country alive.
It's an incredible image, and it really just completely shatters how we usually think about political transitions.
Exactly. I mean, that is the actual story of Abul Hassan Benisadr, the very first president of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And it sets up perfectly what we're going to be looking at today in this deep dive.
Because usually when we talk about revolutions, there's this expectation of a relatively linear process.
Right. Like you overthrow the old regime, you write some new laws, and the new government takes over.
We like history to be neat. But in Iran, less than a year after the February 1979 revolution, the new state was basically eating its own creators.
Yeah, the sheer velocity of the chaos is
Yeah.
what makes this period so crucial to understand. It wasn't a blueprint being carefully executed.
No, not at all. It was a desperate, incredibly violent scramble for absolute survival.
Which brings us to our mission for this deep dive.
Yeah.
We are exploring how, in the span of just a few years, roughly 1979 to 1988, a very specific faction of hardline clerics managed to completely consolidate power. They eliminated their rivals, they hijacked the legal system, and they survived crises that honestly should have wiped them off the map.
I mean, we're talking about armed leftist uprisings, massive ethnic rebellions, a hostage crisis with a global superpower, and a full-scale invasion by a neighboring country.
Any single one of those events would be enough to collapse a brand new government.
Oh, easily. Yet they survived all of them. And not only survived, but they actually weaponized those crises to forge an unbreakable grip on the country.
Now, before we really get into the weeds here, I do need to make something abundantly clear to you, the listener. We are dealing with some intensely charged, highly violent historical material today.
Very much so.
And I want to state unequivocally that neither of us is taking a political side here. We are not endorsing any of the ideologies, the religious interpretations, or the brutal violence we're going to describe.
Right. Our goal is purely analytical.
Exactly. We want to impartially examine the mechanics of power. How did this specific group take control, hold it, and neutralize its enemies? That is our only focus.
It's a forensic examination of a political consolidation. If you want to understand how authoritarian systems are built, you have to look at the structural, the psychological and economic tools they use, completely divorced from any romantic notions of revolution.
So let's start right at the beginning. February 1979. The Shah has fled, the monarchy has collapsed.
Yeah.
Now, you might assume the people who took over immediately sat down in a war room to draft a professional police force or like a transitional justice system. But they didn't.
No. They essentially unleashed localized vigilantes.
Yes, the Khomeini's,
Yeah.
or revolutionary committees.
And to understand the atmosphere of Iran in those early days, you really have to imagine your own neighborhood suddenly being policed by your neighbors.
Right.
But specifically, the neighbors with the most extreme ideological zeal. And now they have assault rifles.
It's terrifying. From the accounts we're looking at, these Khomeini's basically popped up overnight. They were in every government department, every factory, at the airport, on street corners.
And they weren't centralized at all.
No, you'd have a local cleric acting as an honorary head, but the foot soldiers were a mix of, young, idealistic seminarians, neighborhood youth looking for action, and frankly, a lot of thugs and racketeers who just saw a vacuum and stepped into it.
And they operated with absolutely zero oversight. They weren't reading people their Miranda rights.
Obviously not.
They functioned as a decentralized weapon of intimidation. They would walk into homes of affluent families or anyone suspected of being what they called a tagudi.
An idol worshiper or collaborator with the old regime.
Exactly. And they would just confiscate things, not just money, but family heirlooms, book collections, photo
Wait,
albums.
photo albums? Why photo albums?
Because a photo of you drinking a glass of wine at a party 5 years ago, or a photo of your wife without a headscarf, was suddenly evidence of anti-revolutionary corruption.
Wow.
The distance between suspicion and a violent arrest just evaporated overnight.
That is just terrifying. I mean, it's not just a political purge. It's an immediate, violent rewiring of social behavior.
It really was.
The accounts of the sudden enforcement of the hijab are incredibly stark. You had women walking down the street facing mobs shouting, like the phrase was Yaru Sari, Yatu Sari, which means either cover or suffer. Women were harassed, lashed, and dragged off to holding cells. And for men, it was a sudden race to look as unkempt as possible, growing a thick beard, ditching the Western suits for collarless shirts.
Yeah, it became a literal survival mechanism to hide any trace of a secular or affluent past, because appearing affluent was now politically dangerous.
Right. And here is where we get into the actual mechanics of power. The central leadership in Tehran, Ayatollah Khomeini and his inner circle, they were well aware of how unruly these Khomeidas were.
They had to be.
Oh, they knew there was rampant extortion, illegal confiscations, and street violence.
I'm struggling to understand why they didn't just shut them down then. I mean, if Khomeini is trying to build a legitimate, functioning Islamic state, having teenage thugs robbing houses in his name makes him look incredibly weak, right?
You would think so.
Why let armed gangs run your streets?
You would think it makes him look weak, but that assumes his primary goal at that moment was a traditional, orderly state.
Which it wasn't.
It wasn't. His primary goal was keeping his enemies off balance. The chaos was a feature, not a bug.
Oh, wow.
If he had tried to forcefully disarm the Khomeidas, he would have risked alienating his most zealous armed supporters and jeopardizing his own revolutionary credentials.
So it's a calculated chaos. Precisely. What's fascinating here is how these chaotic cells allowed the clerical leadership to maintain plausible deniability.
Right, they could point the finger elsewhere.
Exactly. They could publicly call for order while privately allowing the Khomeidas to act as a brutal sorting house for crude justice and wealth redistribution. It kept the old guard, the generals, the wealthy businessmen, the secular politicians absolutely terrified.
And entirely focused on basic physical survival rather than organizing a counter-revolution.
Exactly.
It makes me think of a violent corporate takeover. The new management comes in, but instead of using the HR department and the legal team to restructure the company, they just hand out weapons to the interns in the mailroom and say, go fire the old executives.
That's a great way to put it.
And by fire, I mean physically drag them out of the building. You skip the bureaucracy entirely.
It's a grim analogy, but highly accurate. And the ultimate institutional expression of this strategy was the creation of the Islamic Revolutionary Courts.
Oh, yeah. Let's talk about those.
These were set up almost immediately, entirely bypassing the moderate provisional government that had supposedly been put in charge.
And these courts were just a nightmare of jurisprudence. No juries, no defense lawyers, no appeals.
Nothing.
The charges were so vaguely worded, it's almost absurd. People were charged with corrupting the earth or combating God. If I am sitting in a courtroom and the judge accuses me of combating God, how do I even begin to formulate a legal defense?
You don't. That was the point. The courts relied entirely on the judge's personal, often arcane interpretation of uncodified Shia penal injunctions.
Right.
It was swift, absolute, and irreversible. And no figure embodied this more terrifyingly than Sadek Kalkali.
Oh, man. The Western press called him the hanging judge, and reading about him is just bone-chilling. Kalkali was a student of Khomeini. He came from a very humble village background, and he seemed to harbor this deep, venomous resentment for the secular westernized elite of the Shah's era.
The psychological contrast between Kalkali and his victims is one of the most striking elements of this period.
Yeah.
You have this rustic, incredibly zealous cleric holding the power of life and death over the most polished, cosmopolitan figures of the old regime.
Take Amir Abbas Huwaida. He'd been the Shah's premier for 13 years. He's described as this sophisticated literary dilettante, a guy who read André Gide, smoked a pipe, wore a fresh orchid in his lapel, and hung out in Parisian intellectual circles.
Right.
When the revolution happened, he actually refused to flee Iran. He believed, perhaps naively, that because he was just a statesman and not part of the secret police, he would face a fair trial.
He fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the revolution he was facing.
Completely. He goes before Kalkali's makeshift court, And Hoveyda actually prepares a detailed, articulate legal defense. He is operating under the illusion that logic and law still apply.
But Kalkali doesn't even engage with the defense.
Not at all.
The trial is a sham. It was a ritualistic humiliation, not a fact-finding mission.
And it doesn't even end with a formal firing squad. Before Hoveyda can even be led out to face the official executioners, a firebrand cleric simply walks up behind him in the hallway and shoots him twice in the head with a revolver.
Yeah.
They didn't even wait for their own kangaroo courts process to play out. It was stunning, performative lawlessness.
And Kalkali didn't restrict this terror to the political elite in Tehran. He became a roving executioner.
Went everywhere.
He traveled to the provinces to crush ethnic uprisings. In Kurdistan, he would hold trials lasting literally 30 minutes before sending Kurdish dissidents to the firing squad. There is a deeply haunting photograph from August 1979 taken in the town of Pavi that won a Pulitzer Prize,
I've seen that.
showing a line of blindfolded men being gunned down.
Yeah, I saw the reference to that in the sources. And the cruelty of his responses. When a wife of one of those Kurdish victims pleaded with Kalkali, crying that her husband was entirely innocent, Kalkali just looked at her and said, if he was guilty, he would go to hell. If innocent, he would end up in heaven.
That statement encapsulates the terrifying logic of the era. It is a complete disconnect from human empathy, replaced entirely by ideological certitude.
Right.
When you believe you are doing the literal work of God, collateral damage isn't a tragedy. It's just a clerical error that heaven will sort out.
And what's wild is that Kalkali didn't just want to kill the living members of the old regime. He wanted to execute history itself. He transitioned from political purging to literal cultural erasure.
He really did. He turned his attention to the physical symbols of Iranian history that contradicted his vision.
He wrote this essay attacking Cyrus the Great, the founder of the ancient Achaemenid Empire, a figure revered by Iranians and historically praised for his human rights legacy. Kalkali called him a despot, a liar, and a sexual pervert. He actually gathered mobs and tried to drive bulldozers to Persepolis to destroy the ancient ruins.
He wanted to wipe the pre-Islamic past off the face of the earth. He was only stopped from destroying Persepolis because local residents and provincial authorities literally, physically stood in front of the machines and resisted.
But he did succeed elsewhere. He mobilized his mobs to completely destroy the massive mausoleum of Reza Shah in Tehran. Reza Shah was the founder of the Pahlavi dynasty, the man who forced modernization and secularism on Iran in the 1930s. Kalkali turned his tomb into literal rubble.
Which perfectly illustrates the first phase of this power consolidation. You don't just remove the personnel of the old regime.
No, you go further.
You psychologically break the populace by erasing the physical memory of the past. You demonstrate that absolutely nothing from the before times is sacred or safe.
Okay, so you've unleashed the vigilantes, you've executed the old guard, and you've blown up the monuments. But at some point, you have to actually govern. Violence can clear the land, but it can't build a state. They needed a legal framework to legitimize their power.
And this transition brings us to one of the most fascinating political bait and switches in modern history, the writing of the Islamic Constitution.
This is where the gap between what the diverse coalition of revolutionaries thought they were fighting for and what they actually got becomes an absolute chasm. Because the initial plan for the Constitution wasn't a theocracy at all.
No, it wasn't. The provisional government, led by Prime Minister Madi Bazargan, who was a moderate religious nationalist, drafted the first version.
Right.
It was essentially a democratic republic model, heavily inspired by the French Constitution. It had a strong presidency, a parliament, and while it paid homage to Islam to make it culturally resonant, it was functionally secular.
And didn't Khomeini sign off on that initially?
He reviewed it and only made a few reactionary tweaks, like barring women from becoming president or judges.
But the hardliners, and ironically many radical leftist groups who just hated Bazargan's moderate stance, demanded that a special assembly be convened to review it.
Yeah, that was a mistake on the left's part.
Right. So they hold elections in the summer of 1979 for an assembly of experts. And through a combination of boycotts by secular groups, intimidation by the comites, and highly organized mobilization by the mosques, this assembly ends up overwhelmingly dominated by hardline Khomeini clerics.
And once they convened, they threw Bazargan's democratic draft in the trash. They began forging a completely new document, one that fundamentally altered the trajectory of the state from a republic to a deeply authoritarian theocratic framework. And the absolute cornerstone of this new architecture was a concept called Walayat-e-Faqih.
The guardianship of the jurist. Let's unpack this concept, because to a modern secular listener, the idea of codifying this into a modern constitution is incredibly jarring. What exactly does it mean?
Well, in traditional Shi theology, the guardianship of a religious jurist was historically limited to societal margins, like
Oh.
managing endowments or looking after orphans and widows who had no legal guardian.
Okay, so it was a custodial role.
Exactly. But Khomeini radically expanded this theological concept into a blueprint for absolute political rule. He argued that in the absence of the hidden imam, the messianic figure in Shia Islam, the most learned and just religious scholar must hold supreme political authority over the entire society to ensure it doesn't stray from God's laws.
So it's essentially placing supreme, entirely unaccountable authority in the hands of one cleric, in this case, Khomeini himself.
Precisely. The Constitution codified that this supreme leader was not accountable to any elected body, not the parliament, not the
It
president.
was untouchable.
He was framed as a free agent with a divine mandate. He appointed the head of the judiciary. He appointed the commanders of the armed forces and the Revolutionary Guards. He could declare war, make peace, and crucially, he could dismiss the elected president.
Okay, let me push back on this because it just boggles my mind. If you were an Iranian citizen in 1979, you've just spent a year marching in the streets, facing down army tanks, enduring strikes, watching your friends die, all to overthrow an absolute unaccountable monarch. How do you then turn around and vote to approve a constitution that essentially installs an absolute unaccountable cleric? I mean, from the outside, it looks like they just traded a crown for a turban. How did the public swallow this?
It is the central paradox of the revolution.
Yeah.
But you have to understand the brilliant and somewhat insidious way the hardliners utilized the language of religion and the context of the moment. First, Khomeini possessed a massive, almost mythic charisma at that time.
He was practically a savior figure to them.
Exactly. To millions of Iranians, he wasn't just a politician. Second, the Khomeinists tapped into centuries of deeply ingrained Shafré reverence for religious scholars. Opposing the Constitution was framed not as a political disagreement, but as a betrayal of Islam itself.
And reading through the details of the Constitution, it's clear it was also a masterpiece of deception. It gave the illusion of democracy while completely gutting it behind the scenes.
Yes, it is full of what we might call legal trapdoors.
Right. For example, Article 3 and Article 9 promised things like legitimate freedoms, the elimination of censorship, and equality before the law. If you just read those, you'd think, great, we have a Bill of Rights. But then you hit Article 4.
Article 4 is the kill switch for the entire democratic facade. It explicitly stated that all laws and regulations, civil, financial, economic, cultural, and political, must be based on Islamic principles.
And who gets to decide what an Islamic principle is?
An unelected body called the Guardian Council, half of whom are directly appointed by the supreme leader.
So the people can elect a parliament, and that parliament can debate and pass a law ensuring freedom of the press. But the unelected Guardian Council can just look at it, say, this violates our interpretation of Islam, and veto it.
Yep.
It completely neuters the elected branches of government. Those legitimate freedoms were totally hollow, contingent entirely on the whims of a few clerics.
Exactly. The Constitution created a dual state, an elected shell that absorbed public frustration, and an unelected theocratic core that held all the actual levers of power. And beyond the mechanics, there was a profound semantic and psychological shift codified in the preamble. It fundamentally redefined the identity of the citizen.
I noticed that. They replaced the concept of the Iranian nation Millet-e-Iran with the Iranian community Ummat-e-Iran.
That is not just a change in vocabulary. It is a monumental leap in political philosophy.
How so?
Well, a nation is bound by geography, shared history, and civic rights. A state governing a nation is responsible for the material well-being of its citizens. But an Ummat, a religious community, is a universalist ideological concept. By defining the populace as an Ummat, the state was no longer just a governing body. It was leading a divine mission.
It framed the entire society as an ideological project. And you can see how this immediately degraded the rights of specific groups.
Oh, absolutely.
Women, for example, were explicitly defined in the Constitution by their sacred motherly duty to produce ideologically committed humans. The state justified pushing women out of the judiciary and forcing them into the hijab under the guise of saving them from Western capitalist objectification, effectively reducing them back to reproductive units serving the state's ideology.
It is a devastating irony. The secular liberals, the leftists, the moderate nationalists, all the diverse groups that formed the coalition to topple the Shah's autocracy found themselves legally subjugated by a theocracy that possessed far broader, more invasive constitutional powers than the Shah could have ever dreamed of.
Okay, so by the end of 1979, the hardliners have crushed the old guard physically, and they have rigged the legal framework to give themselves absolute authority. But laws and guns aren't enough to run a country. You need money.
Right, the economy.
If you don't control the economy, your power is an illusion.
Which brings us to a phase we can analyze as the economic monopolization, or perhaps more accurately, the economic illusion. Because the departure of the Shah's elite left behind an astonishing vacuum of wealth.
Right. When the industrialists, the bankers, the generals, and the royal family fled or were imprisoned, they didn't take their factories and farms with them. They left behind massive conglomerates, and the new state just swallowed it all whole.
In March 1979, Khomeini issued a decree establishing the Mustafa Fan Foundation, which translates to the Foundation for the Disinherited.
Okay.
On paper, it was a massive charitable trust meant to manage confiscated wealth for the benefit of the poor. Overnight, this single foundation absorbed the sprawling assets of the Pahlavi family, the Pahlavi Foundation, and hundreds of privately owned businesses that had been arbitrarily seized by the revolutionary courts.
The scale of the wealth transfer is staggering. The figures show that by 1989, this single foundation controlled an estimated $20 billion in assets. We are talking about 140 massive factories, 470 agricultural conglomerates, construction firms, mines, even hotels. It instantly became the second largest economic entity in the entire country, second only to the National Iranian Oil Company.
And the monopolization didn't stop with confiscations. In July 1979, the provisional government, which was buckling under immense pressure from radical leftist groups demanding socialist policies and striking workers demanding control, hastily passed the Protection and Development of Iranian Industries Act,
which nationalized 51 of Iran's largest private industries, along with all private banks and insurance companies, practically overnight.
Correct. The state became the supreme economic landlord.
Let me try to visualize this for a second. Imagine someone wins the largest mega lottery in history. We are talking tens of billions of dollars in highly complex assets, supply chains, international contracts, and manufacturing plants. But instead of hiring a team of world-class financial experts and logistics managers, they fire all the experts and hand the keys to these factories to people whose only qualification on their resume is that they are highly devout and loyal to the new leadership.
That is an incredibly accurate description of the ensuing disaster. The Mustafa Fan Foundation and the newly nationalized industries became infamous almost immediately for spectacular ineptitude. The experienced technocrats and managers had either fled the country, been imprisoned, or been purged for being insufficiently revolutionary.
And they were replaced by what they called Islamically committed managers.
Yes. Often these were the relatives of prominent ayatollahs or individuals with impeccable revolutionary credentials, but absolutely no background in business or engineering.
What a mess.
You had clerics trying to manage massive petrochemical plants or complex commercial farms.
The result was total economic cannibalization. Factories couldn't source raw materials, machinery broke down and was cannibalized for spare parts because they couldn't import replacements, and production absolutely plummeted. But here's the catch. The regime had just overthrown a government based on the promise of a better life. They had to keep the masses, especially the urban poor, happy. So they resorted to wildly unrealistic populist promises.
This is a classic hallmark of early revolutionary regimes, the deployment of utopian economic promises without any macroeconomic foundation to support them. Khomeini himself publicly promised that electricity, water, and public transportation would be free for the poor.
Free electricity and water. That is an incredible thing to promise a nation.
It was economically ruinous. The promise of free amenities had to be quietly walked back when the sheer cost became apparent, though they did institute heavy subsidies on basic goods that ended up crippling the Iranian economy with inflation and debt for decades.
Right.
But the most disastrous populist promise was the promise of free housing.
This part of the history is wild. Two prominent fiery clerics basically took over the housing organizations. And they didn't just promise to build public housing. They actively encouraged the poor to seize privately owned, vacant houses and empty plots of land in major cities, essentially legalized mass squatting.
And the demographic consequences were immediate and catastrophic. When you broadcast that land and housing in the capital city are essentially free for the taking, you trigger a massive internal migration. Hundreds of thousands of rural, poor, and lower middle-class families flooded into major cities, particularly Tehran.
But the infrastructure obviously couldn't handle it. The regime didn't magically build a utopia.
No. The result was the explosive growth of sprawling, unregulated shanty towns and slums encircling the capital.
The accounts describe the city basically buckling under the weight. Schools became massively over-enrolled, forcing them to run in double or triple shifts just to get kids in the door. The utility grids were crushed, leading to constant blackouts. The traffic became legendary, and the pollution levels skyrocketed.
Yeah, the intended charity, driven by zeal rather than planning, essentially broke the urban landscape of Tehran.
Right.
And as the state clearly failed to manage this wealth efficiently, the true purpose of these entities shifted. The Mostazafin Foundation evolved from a theoretical charity for the disinherited into a vast, shadowy, and completely unaccountable patronage network.
It became a slush fund.
Exactly. It became the primary economic engine funding the regime's hard power. It funded the Revolutionary Guards. It provided lucrative contracts to clerical insiders, and it parceled out wealth to cronies to buy absolute loyalty. It solidified a new economic elite, a class of nouveau riche loyalists whose entire financial existence was dependent on the survival of the clerical regime.
So if we look at the board by mid-1980, the hardline clerics have the vigilantes roaming the streets, they have a constitution that makes them legally untouchable, and they have a multi-billion-dollar patronage network to fund their operations. They are incredibly powerful, but they still have rivals.
Yes, and this is where the revolution truly begins to devour its own.
Because the people who helped them overthrow the Shah, the moderate intellectuals, the liberal nationalists, the radical Marxist groups, they're all still there. And they are increasingly realizing they've been sidelined.
Having secured the legal and economic levers, the clerical establishment turned its highly refined machinery of violence inward, against its erstwhile allies. The first major casualty of this internal purge was the man we talked about at the very beginning, President Abul Hassan Banisadr.
Let's look closer at Banisadr, because his downfall is such a perfect microcosm of the power struggle. He was elected with that massive 75% mandate. He was an intellectual. He had studied economics and sociology at the Sorbonne in Paris. He envisioned an Islamic republic that married Islamic values with democratic institutions and progressive economics.
But Banisadr had a fatal strategic flaw in the context of a ruthless power struggle. He was a political loner. He was a theorist, not an organizer. He lacked a cohesive grassroots network, a dedicated political party, or an armed militia.
And you contrast that with his opponents, the hardliners centered in the Islamic Republican Party, led by figures like Ayatollah Mohammad Beheshti. They had the entire infrastructure of the state at their disposal.
Oh, absolutely.
They controlled the mosque networks, the Khomeidas, the newly formed Revolutionary Guards, and the club-wielding street mobs known as the Hezbollahis, who would literally show up to beat people at opposition rallies.
Banisadr tried to fight this overwhelming force with long-winded academic speeches and newspaper editorials. He was bringing an op-ed to a gunfight.
And the hardliners continuously undermined him. They forced him against his will to accept a hardline prime minister named Mohammad Ali Rajai. And the contrast between President Banisadr and Prime Minister Rajai perfectly illustrates the cultural and class war happening inside the revolution.
Yes.
You have Banisadr, the Paris-educated intellectual in his tailored suits, and then you have Rajai.
Rajai was the exact opposite. He was a former schoolteacher of very humble origins. He had eked out a living at one point as a street peddler selling cheap utensils in the bazaar.
Wow. Quite a different background.
Completely different. He was a product of the fundamentalist religious associations. He was a man who recited Shia morning eulogies, and he had been brutally tortured in the Shah's prisons. He had a blunt, furious, deeply anti-Western rhetorical style. He wouldn't wear a tie. He wore unbuttoned collars.
So he looked the part of the everyman.
He was exactly the kind of unpolished, deeply committed, zealous loyalist the hardliners wanted to project as the true face of the revolution.
The friction between them basically paralyzed the government. Ultimately, the hardliners just flexed their institutional muscle. In June 1981, they used their dominance in the parliament to impeach Banisadr. Khomeini officially dismissed him, and he had to flee the country in disguise on that hijacked Boeing 707.
Right.
But Banisadr was just a politician. His exile was the gentle part of the purge. The real apocalyptic bloodbath was reserved for the Mojahedin Khalq, the MEK.
The MEK was an entirely different kind of threat. They were a highly disciplined, heavily armed guerrilla organization. Their ideology was a potent, unique blend of selective Islamic teachings and Marxist-Leninist theories of class struggle. And because they had actively participated in the street battles to overthrow the Shah, they had looted army barracks and possessed substantial arsenals.
They also had massive appeal among the youth. The accounts point out that a big part of their draw was how they broke traditional gender barriers. They allowed young men and women to mix, to train together under an Islamic canopy, promoting this romantic revolutionary hero worship. If you were a 20-year-old student, the MEK offered a liberating, action-packed alternative to the strict, paternalistic, joyless Islam being pushed by the hardline clerics. The clerics didn't just disagree with them, they were terrified of their demographic appeal.
And when Banisadr was ousted, the MEK made a catastrophic strategic miscalculation. Pushed entirely out of the political process, they assumed their organization was popular enough that if they launched an armed insurgency, it would spark a mass public uprising against Khomeini. So they took to the streets.
And they were horribly wrong. The public didn't rise up. Instead, the streets of Tehran and other major cities turned into literal war zones.
Yeah.
The Revolutionary Guards engaged in bloody urban battles with MEK guerrillas. The MEK retaliated with a campaign of massive bombings, successfully assassinating dozens of top regime officials, including Prime Minister Rajai and Ayatollah Beheshti.
But assassinations rarely topple a deeply entrenched state. They usually just provoke a reign of terror. The regime branded the MEK as hypocrites, monafican, and outright infidels. By labeling them enemies of Islam, it gave the revolutionary courts the theological green light to massacre them without restraint.
This is where we encounter the absolute horrors of Evin prison. It became the epicenter of the crackdown, presided over by revolutionary judges like Mohammadi Jalani and the chief prosecutor Asadullah Lajavardi, who proudly embraced the moniker the Butcher of Evin.
The violence utilized here went far beyond simply executing political rivals. It was a systematic campaign of psychological annihilation.
I read the descriptions of this, and it's just haunting. You read about historical revolutions eating their children, but this was exceptionally systematic. The regime didn't just put their rivals against a wall and shoot them. They actively worked to break their minds.
They did.
Young men and women were subjected to horrific physical and psychological torture. They used extreme solitary confinement. Women were forced to sit on their knees, blindfolded, in silent pigeonhole partitions for days on end, forbidden to speak or move.
Yeah.
And then the culmination of this terror, the forced televised confessions.
The televised recantations are a crucial mechanism of totalitarian consolidation.
But why go to that extreme? If you have your enemy in a cell and you are going to execute them anyway, why spend weeks torturing them just to get them to read a script on camera? What is the utility of the public psychological breaking?
Well, think about the psychology of the public watching those broadcasts. The strategy serves a dual, devastating purpose. First, it completely discredits the opposition's ideology. The MEK relied on a romantic myth of fearless resistance.
Right.
If you take a defiant, heroic guerrilla leader, break him, and put him on national television, weeping, praising Khomeini, and confessing that his entire movement is a fraud funded by foreign imperialists, you destroy the romance. You demoralize their followers entirely.
It kills the idea, not just the person.
Exactly. Second, it induces a state of absolute paralyzing terror in the general populace. It signals that the regime's power is limitless. They can break your mind, rewrite your reality, and make you betray yourself.
It's so dark.
The regime labeled these broken prisoners tawabin, or repentance. They were forced to prove their newfound loyalty by walking through the cell blocks, identifying their own comrades, or leading death squads to hidden safe houses. It dissolved all trust within the opposition networks.
And the men running this machinery were fanatical. Judge Jalani was a terrifying figure. The accounts note he would go on television sitting cross-legged, looking completely relaxed, dispassionately discussing intricate, obscure points of Islamic jurisprudence, while simultaneously managing the logistics of sending hundreds of young people to the gallows every week. He publicly stated that wounded MEK members found in the streets shouldn't be brought to a hospital or a court. They should just be finished off on the spot.
Jalani's fanaticism was absolute. He famously declared that if his own two sons, who had actually joined the MEK, were brought before his court, he would personally sentence them to death without hesitation.
And the tragic end of that story is that his sons actually ended up committing suicide by swallowing cyanide capsules when they were cornered by Revolutionary Guards, because they knew exactly what their own father would do to them.
It is the ultimate display of a system where ideological loyalty supersedes the most basic human bonds. When a judge will kill his own children for the state, it broadcasts to the public that absolutely no one will be spared.
And the terror machinery didn't stop with the armed resistance. Once the MEK was driven underground or into exile, the regime systematically dismantled every alternative intellectual or political voice. The National Front, the old liberal secularists who had fought for democracy since the 1950s, were declared apostates. They had to flee into exile or face prison.
And then there is this spectacularly tragic, almost Shakespearean irony of the Tudeh Party, the Iranian Communist Party.
This part reads like a Cold War spy thriller, and it is a masterclass in the absolute perils of tactical groveling. The Tudeh Party leadership, many of whom were aging intellectuals returning from decades of exile in the Soviet bloc, thought they could outsmart the clerics.
They believed they were playing a long, sophisticated game of historical determinism. They assumed the inept mullahs would eventually fail to govern, the economy would collapse, and the highly organized Marxist vanguard would naturally inherit the state.
So they tried to play nice.
Yes, so as a survival tactic, they constantly praised Khomeini. They vocally supported the brutal crackdowns on the liberals and the MEK. They even offered intelligence to the regime's security apparatus.
They completely underestimated Khomeini's deep, innate theological hatred of atheistic communism. He was just saving them for last. And their demise came from the most unexpected place.
From a defector.
Yeah. In 1982, a KGB officer stationed in Tehran, Vladimir Kuskin, defects to the British. And he brings with him the identities of the entire Tudeh underground network in Iran.
And in 1983, the CIA, under Director William Casey, acquires this KGB informant list. The CIA, hoping to curry some favor with the Iranian regime and primarily wanting to check Soviet influence in the region, secretly passes this list to Iranian intelligence.
The irony is so thick you could cut it with a knife. The deeply anti-American Death to America Islamic Republic utilizes secret intelligence provided by the CIA to completely wipe out the pro-Soviet communists.
Within weeks, the Revolutionary Guards rounded up hundreds of Tudeh members, military officers, and party leaders.
And again, they didn't just quietly execute them, they subjected them to the Evin treatment. These aging communist theoreticians, men in their 60s and 70s who had endured torture under the Shah and dedicated their entire lives to Marxist ideology, were brought onto national television.
Yeah, to confess.
They were forced to confess to a lifetime of communist deceit, to confess to spying for the Soviet Union, to praise the superiority of Islam, and to bow to Khomeini. Imagine being a young leftist watching your intellectual heroes, men you've read and revered, broken and humiliated like that on a grainy television screen. The psychological devastation must have been absolute.
It was a deliberate erasure of alternative intellectual traditions. The state was demonstrating that no ideology, no matter how historically entrenched, could withstand their power. And to prove that absolutely no one, not even the highest religious authorities, was safe, they crossed a line that had never been crossed in modern Shia history. They turned on Ayatollah Shariat Madari.
This blew my mind. Shariat Madari wasn't some secular liberal. He was a moderate, highly respected Grand Ayatollah based in Qom. He had a massive following, particularly among ethnic Azeris in the Northwest. And crucially, back in 1962, when Khomeini was arrested by the Shah and facing execution, it was Shariat Madari who intervened, granting Khomeini the title of Grand Ayatollah to give him religious immunity and literally saving his life.
He was a peer and arguably historically superior in rank, but Shariat Madari believed that clerics should guide society morally, not rule it politically as dictators. His followers formed a rival political party that opposed the hardliners' constitution. That made him a threat.
So after a failed amateurish coup attempt in 1982 by a former aide to Khomeini, the regime falsely implicated Shariat Madari in the plot. And what they did to him was unprecedented. Khomeini ordered him to be defrocked, stripped of his religious rank.
This is a monumental event. In Shia Islam, there is no pope. There is no formal hierarchy that grants or strips rank. It is based on consensus, learning, and the devotion of followers. Defrocking a Grand Ayatollah was an invented extrajudicial reprimand, likely mimicking the Vatican, used purely to exhibit Khomeini's absolute, unchallengeable hierarchical superiority.
They took this 77-year-old Grand Ayatollah, they had mobs attack his house, he was beaten, placed under permanent suffocating house arrest, and forced to apologize on television.
It sent a chilling, unmistakable message to the entire seminary establishment in Qom. The regime was saying if the supreme leader is willing to humiliate, physically abuse, and destroy a revered grand ayatollah who once saved his life, imagine what he will do to a mid-level cleric who dares to speak out. Silence and compliance became the only survival strategy for the religious establishment.
Okay, so let's take stock. They control the streets with vigilantes. They control the laws with a rigged constitution. They control the wealth through the foundations. They've executed or broken the leftists, the liberals, and the rival clerics. But controlling the bodies, the money, and the immediate political opposition wasn't enough for long-term survival.
No, you have to look at the next generation.
Exactly. They understood that if the next generation grew up reading secular books and learning critical thinking, the regime's control would eventually crumble. They needed to reboot society's hard drive.
This brings us to the profound societal engineering of the Cultural Revolution. The clerical establishment recognized that the modern universities were the true incubators of secularism, leftism, and dissent. They viewed the entire educational system established over the previous half-century as a vector for what they called Westoxication, a cultural disease of Western influence and moral decay.
So they didn't just fire a few professors or change a few classes. They shut the entire system down. From June 1980 until the fall of 1983, for over 3 years, every university and college in the country was closed, so the regime could purify them.
It really is like a factory reset of an operating system.
You shut the whole machine down, you wipe the hard drive completely clean, you aggressively delete all the old incompatible files, and you install a massive firewall to ensure no external, unauthorized data can ever enter the system again.
The closure began with the physical conquest of the university spaces, which was highly symbolic. Tehran University, in particular, had long been the bastion of intellectual freedom and leftist organizing. The campus was covered in political banners. Student groups like the MEK and Marxist factions had their headquarters in the faculty buildings.
To break that space, the regime supporters started holding their massive Friday congregational prayers right on the university's central soccer field.
Imagine the symbolism. You have a high-ranking cleric standing at a podium on a university sports field, often holding a G3 assault rifle, delivering fiery hellfire sermons.
Yeah.
And he is surrounded by tens of thousands of regime loyalists, bussed in from conservative neighborhoods, chanting death to America and death to hypocrites, drowning out any possibility of academic discourse.
They were metaphorically and literally occupying the space of educational modernity with traditional clerical authority. They called it cross-breeding the university with the theological seminary. And while the doors were padlocked for those 3 years, the newly formed Supreme Council of the Cultural Revolution went to work.
They were very busy.
They systematically reviewed and purged thousands of professors, administrators, and students. Anyone suspected of leftist sympathies, secular lifestyles, or past ties to the Shah's regime was permanently expelled. Many were handed over to the revolutionary courts.
When the universities finally reopened in late 1983 and 1984, the atmosphere had been completely transformed.
It was a completely different world. The accounts detail how classes, cafeterias, and libraries were strictly segregated by gender. Armed security agents and members of the university comité patrolled the halls monitoring behavior. Professors, particularly in the humanities and social sciences, were terrified.
Because the humanities deal with ideas, and ideas were now policed by theology.
Exactly. Teaching evolutionary theory and biology, teaching Western sociology, or discussing secular civil law became walking through a theological minefield. Say the wrong thing, and your career or your life was over. And the student body had been engineered as well.
Right.
The new students admitted weren't necessarily the ones with the highest test scores. A large quota was reserved for war veterans, families of martyrs, and regime loyalists, chosen for their ideological zeal rather than academic merit. These students often functioned as classroom spies.
That had a chilling effect.
They would aggressively challenge professors, interrupt lectures, and report them to the authorities for being insufficiently Islamic. The university was transformed from a place of inquiry into a place of indoctrination and surveillance.
But the regime knew that by the time someone reaches university, their worldview is largely formed. To truly secure the future, the indoctrination had to start much earlier. It reached into every elementary, middle, and high school classroom through a massive state-sponsored revision of history textbooks.
They didn't just tweak the curriculum. They aggressively rewrote the entire narrative of Iranian history. They framed all 2,500 years of the country's past as nothing more than a dark, oppressive, and ignorant prelude to the glorious arrival of Khomeini.
Yes. The previous Pahlavi dynasty had spent decades emphasizing the glory of the ancient pre-Islamic empires, Cyrus the Great, the Achaemenids, to build a secular nationalist identity. The new Islamic textbooks swept all of that aside.
They just erased it.
The ancient kings were portrayed briefly, and only as oppressive, corrupt tyrants who exploited the masses. The narrative focus of the nation was shifted entirely away from Iran's geography and onto early Islamic history in Arabia and the suffering of the Shia imams.
And the way they mangled modern history was incredible. The Qajar kings of the 19th century were portrayed merely as hedonistic puppets of the Russians and the British. Reza Shah, the man who fundamentally built the modern Iranian state, the railways, the centralized bureaucracy, was depicted purely as a treasonous agent of British mischief whose only lasting legacy was violently deviating the middle class away from Islam.
And perhaps most significantly, they actively sidelined secular nationalist heroes who had genuinely fought for Iranian independence. Mohammad Mossadegh, the immensely popular prime minister who championed the nationalization of Iran's oil in the 1950s and was overthrown in a CIA-backed coup, was heavily marginalized in these new textbooks.
Even though he fought the imperialists.
Because his motivation was secular nationalism, not Islam. He was portrayed as a well-meaning but ultimately accidental and flawed leader who failed precisely because he refused to follow the superior guidance of the clerics.
They turned the complexities of history into a simplistic black-and-white passion play. Every secular or nationalist leader was a villain, a puppet, or a failure. And the clerics were portrayed as the eternal, unblemished, heroic saviors waiting in the wings throughout the centuries. It is a total manipulation of national memory.
And it was very effective.
They were ensuring that a child growing up in the 1980s would see Khomeini not as a political leader who won a messy power struggle, but as the inevitable, divinely ordained culmination of history itself.
Which serves as a perfect segue to the final and undoubtedly the most crucial element of the regime's consolidation. We have analyzed the internal purges, the constitutional rigging, the economic monopolization, and the cultural erasure. But all of those domestic actions created immense friction and unpopularity. The true glue that bound this new state together, the force that ultimately silenced all remaining dissent, was forged in the fires of foreign crisis.
Because if you are an unpopular authoritarian regime looking to silence your domestic critics, nothing works quite as effectively as a terrifying foreign enemy. And the Islamic Republic utilized two massive external events, one entirely self-inflicted, the other violently thrust upon them to cement their absolute power. Let's start with the self-inflicted one, the hostage crisis.
On November 4th, 1979, a group of radical university students, calling themselves students, following the line of the Imam, stormed the walls of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 66 Americans hostage. Their stated demand was the extradition of the Shah, who had recently been admitted to the United States for cancer treatment.
Now, on the surface, if you just watch the news footage from that time, this looks like a spontaneous, uncontrollable act of anti-imperialist rage by a traumatized populace. But when you dig into the history, you see the deeply calculated, highly cynical domestic politics driving it. For months, the left-wing Marxist groups had been constantly attacking the moderate provisional government of Prime Minister Bazargan. The Marxists accused Bazargan of being a liberal sellout, of compromising with Western imperialists, and of failing to aggressively pursue the revolution. The leftist guerrilla groups had actually tried to storm the U.S. Embassy themselves several times earlier in the year.
The Islamic student hardliners realized they were losing the radical edge. The Marxists were outflanking them on anti-imperialism. Storming the embassy was a preemptive, theatrical strike to steal the anti-imperialist thunder back from the left.
It's totally political.
Yes. And while Khomeini didn't order the takeover, the moment it happened, he instantly recognized its immense political utility. He threw the full weight of his supreme authority behind the hostage takers.
And the immediate domestic casualty of the hostage crisis wasn't the United States. It was the moderate Iranian government. Prime Minister Bazargan, who was already paralyzed, humiliated, and exhausted by the constant interference of the clerics, resigned in protest the very next day. The hostage crisis effectively wiped out the liberal democratic wing of the revolution in 24 hours.
It cleared the board of moderates, and it provided Khomeini with the ultimate propaganda tool. He labeled the United States the Great Satan. Let's pause on that phrase. Why that specific, highly theological term?
It is such a dramatic, heavy label. It's not just calling them an imperialist or an enemy state.
Exactly. It wasn't standard Cold War political rhetoric. It was a deeply religious, almost apocalyptic framing. By creating a cosmic, demonic other, Khomeini was unifying his base and delegitimizing all domestic opposition.
Like, you can't argue with that.
It is historically parallel to how the Safavid dynasty in the 16th century consolidated their power over Iran by heavily demonizing the Sunni Ottoman Empire. When your nascent state is vulnerable, chaotic, and facing internal rebellion, you invent a monster at the gates. It demands absolute social cohesion.
Because you cannot debate the nuances of constitutional law or press freedom when your supreme leader tells you that you are locked in a literal, cosmic battle with Satan. Dissent becomes synonymous with aligning with the devil.
And the United States, blinded by the crisis and desperate to free the hostages, inadvertently played right into this narrative of divine struggle.
In April 1980, President Jimmy Carter authorized Operation Eagle Claw. It was a highly complex, incredibly risky, covert military rescue mission involving helicopters and transport planes landing in the Iranian desert, and it ends in absolute disaster. Due to a severe, unexpected sandstorm, a Habub helicopter's malfunction, one crashes into a transport plane on the ground. 8 U.S. servicemen burned to death, and the mission is frantically aborted, leaving the wreckage in the desert.
To the military analysts in Washington, it was a tragic logistical and mechanical failure caused by weather. But to the Iranian leadership and to the millions of masses listening to the state media broadcasts, it was undeniable, tangible proof of divine intervention.
Oh, of course they spun it that way.
Khomeini proclaimed that the sands of the desert had risen up as agents of God to defend the Islamic Republic. It projected an aura of absolute, terrifying invincibility onto Khomeini.
But while the hostage crisis neutered the moderates and gave Khomeini a divine aura, the real anvil upon which the regime forged its unbreakable militarized grip was the Iran-Iraq War. In September 1980, Saddam Hussein looks across the border. He sees Iran in utter chaos. The Iranian army has been decimated by purges of its officer corps, the economy is cannibalized, and the country is entirely isolated on the world stage because of the hostage crisis. Saddam senses a golden opportunity and launches a massive invasion, hoping to easily annex the oil-rich Khuzestan province and perhaps even trigger the collapse of Khomeini's regime.
It was one of the most monumental miscalculations in modern military history. Saddam assumed the ethnic Arab population in Khuzestan would view him as a liberator and rise up to join his forces. They overwhelmingly did not. Instead of breaking the fragile Islamic Republic, the invasion triggered a massive dormant wave of deep-seated Iranian patriotism.
It's an incredible paradox. Saddam Hussein's invasion was meant to crush the Islamic Republic, but it was the very thing that saved it.
To deeply understand the mechanics of how this war saved the regime, we can look to the brilliant 14th century Arab sociologist and historian Ibn Khaldun. He developed a concept called asabiya, which translates roughly to social cohesion, group solidarity, or tribalism. Ibn Khaldun argued that asabiya is the fundamental engine of history and state building. And there is no greater generator of asabiya than a brutal existential war. When a foreign army is marching on your soil, destroying your cities, and killing your citizens, the psychological priorities of the populace instantly rewire. Domestic political squabbles, economic complaints, demands for democracy, they all evaporate. They become viewed as treasonous distractions.
I see exactly what you mean. If you are a student who was protesting in the streets against the closing of a newspaper yesterday, how do you keep protesting today when hundreds of thousands of young Iranian men, your neighbors, your classmates, are dying in the mud on the front lines to protect the physical borders of the homeland?
You don't.
The war completely silenced the opposition because the regime successfully conflated defending the nation with defending the Islamic Republic. It gave the clerics a blank check to enforce absolute totalitarian control in the name of a sacred defense.
And the human cost of this sacred defense was staggering, almost beyond modern comprehension. After the initial Iraqi advances were halted, the conflict evolved into a brutal, static, World War I-style trench warfare. The Iranian military, severely depleted of professional officers and heavy armor, had to rely on sheer numbers and ideological fanaticism.
Right.
They relied heavily on the newly formed Revolutionary Guards and the Basij, a massive volunteer paramilitary force.
And the tactics they used reading about the volunteers is devastating. The accounts describe massive human wave attacks. Teenagers, sometimes child soldiers, whipped up by a state-sponsored cult of martyrdom, tying headbands with religious slogans around their foreheads and physically charging across minefields to clear a path for the troops facing down heavy machine gun fire.
It was horrific.
Some were given little plastic keys by the clerics, told they were the literal keys to paradise that would open the gates of heaven the moment they fell in battle. The sheer scale of the carnage, hundreds of thousands dead, chemical weapons used by Iraq is hard to wrap your head around.
To sustain a society through that level of unimaginable trauma and loss, the state entirely appropriated the mourning rituals of Shia Islam. The conflict wasn't sold to the public as a territorial dispute over a border river. It was explicitly linked to the Battle of Karbala in the 7th century, the foundational defining tragedy of Shia Islam, where the Imam Hussein was martyred fighting injustice.
When you look at the visual culture and the propaganda from the war, it is deeply unsettling and immensely powerful. The state saturated the public sphere with the imagery of martyrdom. At the massive Beheshti Zahra cemetery in Tehran, where thousands of war dead were buried, they literally built fountains that continuously pumped blood-red water to symbolize the blood of the martyrs.
They wove the grief of the mothers into the fabric of the state ideology. When a young, unmarried soldier died at the front, his neighborhood wouldn't just hold a funeral. They would set up a hele in the street, a glittering, mirrored bridal canopy decorated with lights and flowers to celebrate his figurative wedding and death, linking it back to ancient Shia lore about martyrs marrying in heaven.
Massive, multi-story street murals were painted across Tehran, depicting modern soldiers in khaki uniforms dying in the arms of the mythical, glowing Imam Hussein. The state successfully elevated a brutal geopolitical war with a neighboring dictator into a sacred cosmic duty. Dying for the state was equated with dying for God.
And in the process of fighting this 8-year war, the institutional landscape of Iran was permanently altered. The Revolutionary Guards, who started the revolution as a disorganized, untested collection of zealous militias, were forged in the blood of the trenches into a massive, highly structured military force.
Wow.
By the end of the war, they had their own army, navy, and air force, and they had gained control over massive sectors of the economy through military contracting. The war built the deep state that rules Iran today.
So we step back and look at the blueprint of this entire chaotic consolidation. In 1979, the secular intellectuals, the moderate nationalists, and the leftists thought they were playing a complicated political chess match. They thought they could ride the tiger.
Yeah, they were very naive.
They believed they could use the charismatic clerics to rally the traditional masses, overthrow the Shah, and then eventually sideline the mullahs to usher in a modern democratic or socialist state.
They deeply underestimated their opponent. The clerics weren't playing a gentleman's game of political chess. They were fighting a ruthless, zero-sum war of absolute survival. They utilized centuries of deeply ingrained seminary solidarity. They possessed a profound, almost instinctual understanding of mass psychology and religious symbolism, and they exhibited an utter, unblinking ruthlessness regarding the destruction of their enemies.
They weaponized decentralized vigilante violence to physically crush the old guard and terrorize the affluent. They manipulated a democratic constitution, inserting trapdoors to build an inescapable theocratic cage. They seized tens of billions of dollars in economic assets to build a vast, dependent patronage network. They physically and psychologically broke their former allies on national television to destroy the very idea of resistance. They shut down the entire higher educational system to rewrite history and indoctrinate the youth. And finally, they brilliantly used the cover of a devastating foreign war to silence the last whispers of dissent under the banner of patriotism.
That's the playbook.
It wasn't an accident. It wasn't just chaos. It was a dark, incredibly brilliant masterclass in the mechanics of authoritarian consolidation.
It serves as a stark reminder of a fundamental truth regarding political transitions. We like to place our faith in laws, in constitutions, and in democratic norms. But those institutions are incredibly fragile, almost paper-thin, when confronted by a highly organized, heavily armed, and deeply ideologically driven faction that is willing to use crisis and manufacture crisis to bypass every check and balance.
It brings us right back to the beginning, to the idea of the revolution being a clean break. The people thought they were getting a reset, but the surgeons who stepped in didn't heal the break. They placed the patient in a vice grip, tightening it year after year until the society couldn't even breathe, let alone complain.
And this historical reality leaves us with a critical, lingering question, one that extends far beyond the borders of Iran and the decade of the 1980s.
Yes. I want you, the listener, to ponder this idea as we wrap up today's deep dive. The Islamic Republic built its entire foundational architecture on the concept of resistance. its very institutional DNA is engineered for crisis.
Right.
It was built to purge the old elites, to fight the great Satan, to wage a sacred existential war against invaders, and to perpetually hunt for ideological enemies within its own borders. It's a machine designed exclusively for conflict. But what happens to a state built entirely for war when the wars eventually end?
That is the big question.
When the external enemies are vanquished, or when the borders finally stabilize? Can a revolution that is genetically engineered solely for resistance ever learn how to just govern?
It is a profound structural tension, and it is the defining friction that continues to shape the region to this very day.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking the hard questions, keep looking below the surface of the history you think you know, and we will see you next time.